Hey, welcome back to Discovering After Effects presented by RampantDesignTools.com. My name once again is Casey Ferris, and today we're going to be learning about tracking. Tracking is an incredibly useful thing in After Effects. It's basically matching the movement of footage. So we're going to look at a couple different situations where you would use tracking, as well as maybe a little bit how to stabilize footage. So let's start with the basics. If you go up to your window menu, about halfway down you'll see the tracker. And there's a bunch of little buttons in this tracker palette. But you pretty much can't do anything until you pick a motion source. And you can either do that by selecting a layer or by picking it under this motion source menu. So I'm going to hit Track Me because that is the layer that I want to track. This is just footage pre-composed. So this is a pretty simple little camera movement, just a handheld pan. And we're going to blur out this license plate. This is my friend's car. Please don't steal this license plate or something. I don't know what you would do. I'm not a thief, and so if any of you are thieves, don't be a thief. You know what I'm saying? I don't know what you would do with a license plate number except for like call and complain about it, but I don't know, maybe it's a big deal. Anyway, so we're going to blur it out so the rest of the world doesn't see it. So I'm going to select my layer in my comp, or I can select it under motion source. And I'm going to stretch this out so we can see it a little better. So when I hit track motion, it makes a little track point right in the center. And a little bit about track points. This center little cross thing, that's the attachment point. So if I apply this to a null object or a text layer, whatever the layer is, that's where its little point is going to go on this track. This inside square, any pixels that are inside this square, that's what it's going to look at for the tracking information. And so if I move this over here to this G, it's going to have this little curvy thing and the bottom of this G. That's what it's going to look for. And so for each frame, it's going to try and find this little picture, and it's going to put the center point right here in relation to the picture. And so it's going to try that every single frame. This wider square is where it's going to look for this information. So if I had this outer square stretched out a lot, it's going to take a while to track because it's looking for these pixels everywhere inside of this huge rectangle. The good thing is your camera can move quite a bit and it can still find that, but the bad thing is it takes a long time. Basically, the general rule is you want to make this as small as you can because it'll save you time and it will make it a little bit more accurate. Also, this square, I want to make sure this middle part stays in the same place. And so if I put it right here, it's going to be really hard not only for this to track it, but it's going to be hard for me to tell if this is moving, especially this way. So I want to put my attachment point at a place where it's really easy to tell if it's moving or not. So I'm going to put it at the end of this little white line on this T. So instead of tracking the GT, I'm not really interested in doing that. I'm interested in blurring out this license plate. So what I'm going to do is track this license plate, and then I'm going to put an adjustment layer over it to blur it. There we have our little fuzzed out license plate. So let's see how we do something like this. I'm going to open my footage, and I'm going to start in the middle because I know I can get a good frame off of the middle. And so I'm going to select my layer I want to track, and I'm going to hit track motion. And I'm just going to track the position. You can actually, there's a bunch of different types of tracking you can do. And we'll get into perspective corner pin a little bit. Parallel corner pin is similar, but we're going to do transform. And so this is just tracking the position, rotation, and scale. But we're just going to track the position because that's really all we need for something like this. And so I'm going to take my tracking point and I'm going to pick a nice place, maybe this little circle in the 8. And I'm going to up my search area just a bit. And you know what? I'm a little bit concerned with this moving from this circle to this circle, so I'm actually going to track the middle here. And let's see how that works. It's looking good so far. And one thing I like to do is click the track on and off. And so I'll just click this play button and stop it and do it maybe for a second, something like that. And there we go. Now I'm going to select my layer and I'm going to hit U to bring up the keyframes, and I see my track point 1, and all my keyframes are here in the last 2/3 of this clip. So I'm going to put my playhead over here, and I'm going to go to my next keyframe on my feature center here. Boom. And that jumps to that original frame that I started tracking at. And I'm going to analyze backward. And just click it on and off, on and off. And there's a couple reasons for clicking it on and off. The first is that each time you click this, it basically takes a picture of what you're tracking and it tries to find that image in this search area. And because of a perspective change or because of motion blur, you might not necessarily be looking for the exact same image here that you would be over here. You see how they're different? And so every few frames I click this on and off because it takes a new picture. And this is called feature adapting. And you can set your options to adapt the feature on every frame. The only problem with that is if your track gets off, it kind of doesn't know it. It just kind of gets more and more off. And so the way I like to do it is just leave it in the default options and click this play button on and off. And I get pretty good track. And if I think it's off, I can move it just a little bit. And if I'm really worried, I can just analyze one frame at a time. And so yeah, it's getting pretty bad now, but I'll just keep going. And each time I move this, it's keyframing the position. And on that frame, it tracked it pretty well. Pretty well. That one's worse. And so there we go. Okay, and that's our last frame. And so here I have this 8 on my license plate tracked all the way through my footage. So that's great. What do we do with it now? In your tracker panel, you'll see something called a motion target. And if you hit edit target, it's going to say, okay, what layer do I apply this motion to? And because I only have one layer, it doesn't know what to do with it. So I'm going to make a new layer, and I'll just make a null object. And remember, a null object really isn't anything. It's an invisible layer, but it's great because you can parent things to this null and you can use your tracking data that way. So I'm going to go back to my track me layer, go to my track me motion source. My current track is tracker 1, and I'm going to edit my target. And now it says, okay, well, I could apply this to null 3. And I said, hey, that sounds good. So I'm going to hit OK. And so now my motion target is null 3. And so I'm just going to hit apply, and it's going to say, okay, what dimensions? Do you want X only, Y only, or X and Y? And in this case, I want to track both up and down and left and right. So that's X and Y. I'm going to hit OK. And so now if I go to my null layer and I hit U to bring up my keyframes, you'll see that this null's position is keyframed every single frame. And it perfectly follows the motion of our license plate. So that's pretty much the hard part. I can right click and make a new adjustment layer, and maybe I'll make this one a blur. So I'll go to fast blur and blur it a lot. And I'll turn off my layer and add a mask, and I have my adjustment layer selected, and I'll just draw a really rough mask around my license plate. So I can turn that on, and there I have my blurred out license plate. So now if I scrub through, you'll see this does not move with the footage. And so I'm going to hit Command Z, and I'm going to parent, and I'll call this blur. I'm going to parent my blur layer to my tracking data. And so everywhere that tracking data moves, it's going to take that blur along with it. And I'm going to turn off my null object, turn on my blur, and there we have our little sensor blur that follows the motion of this car. So not too difficult. If you play around with the tracker, you'll definitely get the hang of it. Just takes a little bit of practice. I want to show you really quickly another type of tracking, because this track is just using the position of one point. But if we wanted to do something really tricky, like a screen replacement, here I have a computer with a bright green screen, and I have some motion, because this is also shot handheld. And there's a little bit of perspective change and just generally some shaky footage. So I can actually track this shot and replace this screen and make it look pretty darn believable. So here's my footage with a replaced screen. So how do we do that? I'm going to go to my original footage, and I'm going to go a little bit faster this time since we're a little bit familiar with tracking. And I'm going to select my footage and hit track motion. And my track type, I'm going to go to perspective corner pin. So now instead of one track point, I have 4. This is where things get a little bit crazy. First of all, I'm going to make sure I'm at full res, and I'm going to move my track points to the corners of my screen. So this top corner, I'll put track point 1, track point 2, I'll put up in this top right corner, track point 4, lower right, and track point 3, lower left. So now I'm just going to track the corners of this screen, and it's going to apply that data to an image. So I'm going to analyze forward and just clicking it on and off, trying to look at all of my track points all at once, which is a little hard to do actually. And I'm just going to keep going through my footage until I'm all the way through what I want to use. And so I tracked all the way to the end, and now I'm going to track backwards. So I'm just stopping every once in a while just to give it a break. Good, so tracking's done. And now I'm going to make a new solid, and I'll make it pink. And right away I'm going to pre-compose because I want to be able to drop footage into this, and I'm going to call it placeholder. No, I'm going to call it screen. And so there's my screen pre-comp and my computer screen. And so now I can edit my target, and I'll apply it to screen, and I'll hit apply. And let's see how our track did. And that screen looks pretty good. It's matching the motion, and it's also matching the perspective change that we have. And now, because I pre-composed that solid, I can drag anything I want into this comp, and there's just a screenshot, and it looks like that's on the computer. And the only problem is this new screen is a little bit smaller than my green, so I can fix that just by scaling this up a little bit. In this case, it doesn't really matter too much. So I can scale it up, and it's very likely that no one will know the difference. And there's my footage with a brand new screen. Looks good. I can also add a reflection to this, or maybe add little static effects or anything I want to do to maybe sell this effect a little more. But for now, that looks pretty good. I also want to show you a pretty cool example of using tracking. This is a shot of a building, Bill's Discount Medical, and it's shot handheld. But the cool thing is, I added this sign in After Effects, and I also added the sky. So both of those were added by tracking this building and parenting these to the tracking data. And for this project, I just tracked this footage with position and rotation checked. And so I had 2 tracking points, and I tracked one over here and one over here. And in a quick note, when you're tracking rotation, you want to track as wide as you can. I probably could have even tracked a little wider, because a tracker isn't perfect. It does wiggle a little bit. And the closer these track points are together, that little pixel wiggle is going to translate to rotation. And so it might look like something's rotating a little bit when really it's not. And so the farther apart you make them, the more accurate your rotation tracking will be. I also wanted to show you another really cool thing I could do with tracking. I can actually take this layer and I can stabilize this footage and make it seem like it's on a tripod. All I have to do is go to track type, stabilize, and make sure my target is the same layer that I'm tracking, and I'll hit apply. X and Y sounds good. So here's my stabilized footage. not moving around too much. It's a lot more steady, but there's a couple problems with this. There's issues with motion blur, and there's also rolling shutter issues. And so it kind of makes this image look a little bit jiggly. And so when you stabilize it, it ends up looking a little bit weird. And even if you stabilize an image, there's nothing you can do to reduce that motion blur. So even though your image might be pretty steady, the edges might kind of blur every once in a while, and that won't look good either. So this is definitely something that only works under pretty special circumstances. But if you're under those circumstances, it's a great tool. The other problem is a lot easier to fix, which is obviously this frame is moving around and there's these black edges here. There's a few ways to deal with that, but the easiest one is just to scale this up. So you lose some resolution and you have jiggly edges, but well, that's what you get for not using a tripod. Should have thought about that. Anyway, so I hope that sheds some light on tracking and the tracker tool in After Effects. Like I said, make sure you go out and practice this before you rely on tracking something in a shot, because it does take some getting used to. Even people that are really good at tracking sometimes have to do it a couple times. So don't feel bad. Go out and shoot, track things, stick things to your footage, and feel free to send me messages on the Rampant message boards. Get a hold of me somehow, and I'll try and answer any questions you have. And show me some of the stuff you track. I'd like to see it. So, but I think that's going to do it for me. I'm Casey Ferris with RampantDesignTools.com. Thanks for watching.